Good morning, everyone, or as I always say, good morning or good afternoon, or whatever the time is that you come to watch this. Um, as I've said before, I'm recording this one a little bit early, so I won't be live. But as always, there are people there who are able to respond, who are able to reply to you if you've got any questions or any comments about any of the things I talk about or any of the records we hold in our collections. My name's Lorna. I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archives Service. And this week we are looking at the subject of fake news and reliable sources. It's a very, very current topic. As I always say, I'm aware that there are probably children watching this, there are probably adults watching this, and so I'll try and make it something that's of interest and use to everybody. It's, I guess, isn't always a subject that's current and relevant, but it's a term that we've become very used to hearing in recent year or two about fake news. But how do we know what the truth is? Who do we trust to give us our information? And so I'm going to look at some of those things as we go forward. Here in the UK, with the coronavirus situation, we've had a real drive on trying to work out what's the truth, what's fake news, what's wrong. Things like BBC, Twitter, Facebook, different companies trying to weed out, stories going around that if you just eat plenty of garlic, you'll be safe, and the scientists trying to prove or disprove those stories and say, no, that one's not correct, don't believe it. So fake news is something that we're dealing with all the time, but it's also something that we have always lived with, and I'll give some examples about that from our collections. There's a few different ways I want you to think about it. One thing is when genuine mistakes are made, so something is believed as a genuine opinion, which then gets shared, which then turns out not to be correct. So that's one thing. Another time, something can be slightly different from that. It can be something that's just a misunderstanding. So, a misunderstanding gets made and then it gets acted on and so on. But obviously, there are times when fake news is much more serious than that. It's deliberate. It's an attempt to form an opinion or to take away an opinion. And so we've got examples of all of these sorts of things in our collections, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Of course, in some countries, points of view altogether are banished. There can be an entire swathe of opinions that are just not allowed, or that the information of what's happening elsewhere doesn't get through to them because certain news channels are banned, things like that. So there's a lot to think about around this subject. We rely on some documents being correct. Some documents absolutely must, as far as they can be truthful and be correct. So, for instance, passports, we rely on these to be true. We rely on them to be fact-checked. We rely that when you go through security in an airport, something that the information that every person is presenting is truthful and correct. Letters from hospitals, we rely that when someone tells us we're better or we're cured, that's true. So we rely a lot as human beings on people telling us the truth and us being able to act on information that we've been given. But sometimes we do have to question that. So one of the things I think we need to do is to learn which sources we trust. So again, here in the UK, one of the things that's been said to us is, about health information is trust the NHS. So if the NHS are saying something, then that's been fact-checked and so on. Whereas if someone just forwards you a WhatsApp message or a text message that they've had from someone, where's the proof in that? So one thing is to try and trust your sources, but that can be quite difficult. And again, for some people, trusting their government is absolutely instinctive. For other people, trusting their government is not easy because there's been a background there or a story there. So sometimes it's not an easy decision. It's not easy to work out who to trust. One of the things we come across, or we're always thinking about when we're working with archives, is that any document is only as true as the person who wrote it. So everything is written by a person, therefore it carries with it that person's opinions or that person's take on things. So these are all just things to have in the back of your mind as we look at this subject. But I'm going to talk you through some of the things that I've put up on the website for you to have a look at. And the first one is an extract from the Oban Times from 1895. So as I said, sometimes things are just genuine mistakes. They're told as fact and then very quickly they become accepted as fact. And this is an example, as I say, from 1895 from the Oban Times, which is held in our Lochaber archives. And it describes the experiences of Duncan Macpherson, who is described as being very creditable, very trustworthy, very reliable. But he, on his boat out off the Ardnamurchan coast, sees what he thinks is a sunken ship. So he doesn't quite know what it is, but he wants to go and see it. So he rows towards this ship. And as he's looking at it, suddenly, he says, all the water about him became thrashed into a foam, like a huge sea creature's tail was bashing the water, and all the waves started to go up. And so he believed entirely that there was a huge sea serpent there. And then he says at one point that it was 20 feet straight out of the water, the sea serpent. Absolutely believed it. Then next newspaper article from a few days later is somebody saying, we think what it was just the waves crashing off the rocks and causing the foam, and a piece of wood or something like that causing what looked like this monster 20 feet out of the water. And the person who's writing this letter into the newspaper says, I can say now that of an estimate that of the population who don't believe this story, it's a trifle over 99%. Nobody believes the story anymore. But you can see how one person who's reliable and trustworthy, when they believe it, people go, well, they must be right, we trust them. And the same thing obviously has happened here with the Loch Ness Monster. Now, I'm not going to get into a debate about whether the Loch Ness Monster is real or not. That's a dangerous debate. But it's something that, it goes on and on, because if you trust a person who thinks they've had an experience, then it makes people question their own thought processes and they want to believe it. Sometimes a belief in something can cause you to act very quickly in a way that's maybe afterwards not very wise. And an example of that is something that we've got up on our website from our Sky archives. And it's from 1890. And it's the story of an Italian man who turned up in Skye with a monkey, a pet monkey. And he went to the local school and said, if you pay me some money, I'll let you all see this monkey. And the teacher said, the children here are just too poor, we can't afford to see it. I'll give you a one-off sum if you'll let them see the monkey. And he said, no, there's no way. And so anyway, he went away, carried on wandering around Skye, found shelter in a barn for the night with the monkey. And then at 1 o'clock in the morning, the monkey got out the shed and broke into a house. Apparently they're very criminal. But the monkey got into this house, and the woman who owned the house heard the noise, and she came downstairs thinking that someone was breaking in, and she brought down a pitchfork, a big hay fork, and she, in the spur of the moment, in the middle of the night, in the dark, when she was frightened, believed that the monkey was the devil. And the monkey, see, this story wouldn't be funny except that the monkey had put on her hat. And so the monkey was wearing her best Sunday hat and apparently was doing the toilet. And she, in her fear in that moment, so much believed what her imagination had told her that she killed the monkey and buried it in her garden. And then years later, she left £4 in her will to the Italian man and said, it was me, dear Mr. Italian, she said, it was me that killed your monkey, and I'm so sorry. I genuinely believed that it was the devil. So although that's not really an example of fake news, it's an example of how dangerous it can be if you wholeheartedly believe something that's not right, and then you can cause damage with it. It's can be dangerous. So that's when things are genuine mistakes and how they can cause a belief to become common knowledge. Another example that I mentioned at the beginning was if something's just a misunderstanding or a miscommunication, and how quickly that can spread as a piece of fact. So one of the famous ones is a message sent from the front during the war saying it's a miscommunication of saying that we're going to advance. So can you send troops? And what they had actually said was they were going to advance. Now I don't know whether that's a true story or not, but you have to be very careful with how you pick your words in case things are misinterpreted. And an example from that we have on our website is again from Fort William, and that's from a police occurrence book. And it is to do with, it calls it the spreading of false news about the landing of German parachutists in Tulloch. The message had gone from someone had taken a message, they'd passed it on to someone local, they'd passed it on to the police had gone to investigate to see if they were overrun with German parachutists, and there was nothing there. And so they had to trace that story back through each person who'd told it until eventually they came to the original telegraph message boy who had taken the message down wrong. But because it was it was something in a situation of people being frightened or worried, or they've got it in the back of their head that might happen. So when they read it, that's what it is, and it can lead to a huge chain of events happening. And so in that example, the police had to write into their daily occurrence book, this was not true, this was false news, we acted on it, but it was turned out to be incorrect. So those are things where things are mistakes or misunderstandings. Sometimes it's something a lot more dangerous than that, a lot more scary than that, and that is when people deliberately falsify things. So people deliberately tell only one side of the story, or suppress and keep quiet the other side, or change information to get people to take one certain opinion, things like that. And so there's examples for these on our website for you as well. One which I love, and I'm sure you will all love it too when you go and have a wee look, is a really early example of photoshopping. When you take a first look at this picture on our website, and if you've got another device with you, then you can have a look at it while I'm talking, but it's a photo of Culloden battlefield. It's instantly recognisable because it's got the big memorial cairn of Culloden, and there's someone standing in front of it in full Highland dress. But if you look more closely at it, you'll realise that the photo is superimposed, and it's a really early example, late 1800s, early 1900s example of photoshopping, because the person in the photo is called Theodore Napier, and he was an Australian. His parents had been Scottish, had gone out from Scotland to Australia in the 1800s, and he had grown up with this passionate nationalism for Scotland. And so he had apparently walked around Australia a lot in full Highland dress. And this example of this photograph is him basically cut and pasted, superimposed over himself over a picture of the top of Culloden battlefield. And at first glance, you think it's a genuine photograph, and then you think that's not quite right. So that's another type of fake news. Now, obviously, that one is not particularly dangerous. That's somebody following a passion and being interested in it. And for those of you who are interested, do go and look at him. He did eventually come back to Scotland and was heavily involved in setting up the commemorations for the Battle of Culloden. But it's just, as I say, that one's not dangerous, but it's interesting if you start thinking about that. If you can manipulate a picture, how difficult that is for the police, for courts, for all sorts of people who then go, well, how do we rely on what is the truth? What can we trust? And that is a very early example. If you think now how much cleverer people are with technology and how much more sophisticated those sorts of things can be, it's a really interesting subject to think about. There's another one that we've put on there for you, but it's a little bit more silly because it's of Dounreay from our Wick archives, and it is the Daleks taking over Dounreay. So a little bit easier to tell that that one's not real. So that's that thing. The next thing to think about is propaganda. As I said at the beginning, one of the things we think about all the time when we're dealing with archives is, what is the context that this document was written in? Who wrote it? What did they believe? What was their agenda? Was there a reason that they took a certain viewpoint? Were they likely to be taking a certain viewpoint? Because, as I said, every document is only written by the person who wrote it. And sometimes they will deliberately be putting an opinion into that, and sometimes they won't. We all carry with us prejudices or opinions or thoughts that we think are commonly held, but it's actually just because of who we are, how we've been brought up, what our age group is, what our sexuality is, what our religion is. All of those things play into an opinion that you have held deep in you, that you probably wouldn't be able to name, probably wouldn't be able to identify it without thinking about it. And so that's always something to think about. And that, in its worst form, can be propaganda, where the person who's writing it, they're publishing that information with a view to promote a certain viewpoint or to take away from or discredit another viewpoint. So they want you to believe what they believe. It can be very prejudiced. It can miss things out that are, that can tell one side of the story, or it can cast doubt on an opposing view or an opposing person. And there's some examples of this on our website. One that I deal with a lot, and if you've watched my Jacobite subject, you'll know is one that I'm really interested in as a subject, the Jacobite era. And that's a great example of times when things were, terminology was used to describe someone. People were described in a certain way depending on what their beliefs were. Things like the Jacobite uprisings being described as rebellions. That depends on your viewpoint, whether it's a rebellion or not. Now, in my job and in our jobs as archivists, it's not our job to take opinions like that. We try to have no opinions on whether things are right or wrong in the past, whether the Jacobite risings were right or wrong. But what we have to do is interpret the documents, present the documents to people and say that they tell part of that story, regardless of whether they're correct or not. Jacobite risings are a great example because they talk about, often the government side of it would talk about Catholics with a certain terms to make them sound like they were in the wrong, to make them sound like they were dangerous, things like that. And we still see that today, where people maybe of different religions or of different backgrounds are described slightly differently, so that whether you're aware of it or not, people start to form opinions of things because they're not told to think, but kind of led to think in a certain way sometimes. And so it really pays in everything like that to think, who's giving me this information, and can I trust them? Why are they saying it? Are they trying to get an end result? Obviously, a lot in historical documents, you find that people will say a certain thing because they want to become prime minister, or they want to succeed in a certain thing, and so that's why they word things in a certain way. An example, again, on our website to show you, is a letter written by Lachlan Mackintosh of Raigmore. And it was written in 1843, which is a big year in Scottish history for different reasons, but he was writing to the Secretary of Home Affairs. And I'm going to read the exact quote here. He says, "I purchased many years ago the only newspaper then in the northern half of Scotland, to prevent it falling into hands into which it would do infinite mischief." So he says the north of Scotland is leaning one way politically, and I don't want that. So I've just bought the newspaper. And he says, "It now is the medium for giving government advertisements to the northern public." So basically, the press wasn't saying what he agreed with politically, and so he just bought over the newspapers so that they were unable to say it anymore. That's a really dangerous thing, and that's something, again, that we still see today, the censoring of the press. That people will say, no, I don't agree with what you're saying, so I'm just not going to let you have a voice. Really dangerous, but something that again that we see throughout history of people who are able to take control of something and change what it says or how it's said. One thing I think I take a lot of comfort in my role is that nothing is new. So when you look through these things, you'll see there has been in the past control of the press, there's been censorship, there's been propaganda, there's been people pushing one view because they believe, and people pushing the opposite view because it's what they believe. And all of those things appear through our records. Before we went into lockdown, I was supposed to be going down to Aviemore Primary School and speaking to them in March. And this was one of the subjects we were going to look at, was reliable sources. How do you trust what's written? And how do you learn the skills to analyse what's written? In all of the documents that we hold, they represent themselves. They just stand alone as documents. But you always have to remember that they have been written by somebody who will have had an opinion. And an interesting example of this is in 1715, in the Jacobite Rising, our records are full of references to it and what's happening and who's doing what. And by the time it comes to the 45, in the Inverness Borough minutes, the town council minutes, there's no reference to the Battle of Culloden or to the 1745 uprising. Just nothing, just a big blank page. To my mind, and I don't know if I'm right or not, but I think that's maybe because they just didn't know who was going to win, and they thought, we're just not going to commit, because once it's committed in writing, then people will wonder, it'll be there and we'll be committed to one side or the other. So to look at that document, if you didn't know about the Jacobite Risings, you might look at it and just think nothing had happened that day. So leaving information out is representative of something. And that's my feeling, is that they just thought, we're going to hedge our bets and not commit because we don't know who's going to win. So yeah, all sorts of things to think about in that. And like I say, there's no right or wrong for a lot of this, but what there is it's a useful skill for if you're watching as a school group or you're watching as a young person, then that's a really useful skill to know. Just as something to always have in the back of your head, that whatever you're reading has been written by a person with a view in mind, an end goal in mind. Very few, if any, documents are completely neutral. And as I say, it doesn't mean any of them are right or wrong. It just means that you need to have that in the back of your head and be aware of it. So there's all the documents I've talked about are up on the website for you to have a look at. And also there's some activities and things for you to think about on there to do. As always, there's a word search. Please do it. I spent many a long hour creating all the word searches. There's a template of a newspaper article if you want to write one. But one of the main things I'd love you to do and to have a think about is to try and write, take a subject. It can be anything at all. It could be something like divorce or abortion or anything that has two viewpoints. Coronavirus is a great one, and write about the same subject, one positive article and one negative article. Because I think, particularly with the virus, you could very easily write, we can hear the birds singing more, the pollution levels are down, everybody's enjoying more time with their family, people are in the house more, families are eating dinner together more. There's a lot of positives about it. And on the other side of that, of course, is lives are being lost, people are frightened, people are lonely, people are dying and being ill. And that's the exact same subject, but you could write one article with a very positive spin on it and one article with a very negative spin on it. And that will just get you to start thinking about how any subject can be written with two different voices and two different opinions. It's an interesting thing to have a think about. I hope this has been interesting or made you think a little bit anyway. And maybe when you next read a headline in the newspaper, you'll be like, who wrote this? What were they trying to get me to do here? Advertising, that's another good thing to think about. You know, every article, everything that's written from an advertising point of view, it may well be true, or it may be uh, true, but they've blown it out of proportion because that's the thing that will make you buy the product. So I hope that thinking about this will make you look around and go, oh yeah, who's written this? Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed it. Um, we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Next week, we're looking at transport. So we'll have some examples of things to do with the amazing Operation Snowdrop up in Caithness, the development of canals, railways, all sorts of things. And I know that's a subject a lot of people are passionate about. So hopefully we'll see you then. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves. Bye.